Good evening, everyone, and welcome. On behalf of Spencertown Academy and the Committee of the Festival of Books, I'd like to welcome you to our virtual festival. We are honored and delighted to have with us this evening Akhtar to discuss his book, Homeland Elegies, named one of the 10 best books of 2020 by the New York Times, a best book of 2020 by a host of publications, including The Washington Post, Publishers Weekly, The Economist, and O Magazine, and a finalist for the 2021 Andrew Carnegie Award for Excellence in Fiction. Also joining us this evening to lead the conversation is our very good friend and committee member, Julie DeLisle, recently retired as the director of the Chatham Public Library. Before we begin, a few notes. We'll have a Q&A following the discussion. Please submit your questions at any time via the Q&A button on the information bar at the bottom of your screen. On Thursday, we'll be hosting author Russell Shorto discussing his book, Small Time, A Story of My Family and the Mob. All book festival programs are free, but you still need to register online by end of day tomorrow for that event. Also, please remember our online specialty bookstore. All proceeds from those sales and donations go to the Academy programs and our annual budget, so your support is crucial to the ongoing efforts and survival of Spencertown Academy. Akhtar is a novelist, screenwriter, and Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright. His first novel, American Dervish, was published in 20 languages, and overall his work has been published and performed in over 24 languages. His plays include Disgraced, which won the Pulitzer Prize for Drama and a Tony Award nomination, Junk, The Who and the What, and The Invisible Hand. As a screenwriter, he received an Independent Spirit Award nomination for the film The Enemy Within. Among his many awards and honors, Mr. Akhtar is the recipient of the Steinberg Playwriting Award, the Nestroy Award, the Erwin Piscator Award, fellowships from the American Academy in Rome, MacDowell, the Sundance Institute, and Yaddo, where he serves as a board director. This year, he was named the New York State author by the New York State Writers Institute, succeeding Colson Whitehead. Please join me in welcoming Akhtar and Julie DeLisle. Over to you.
Thank you, Kelly.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. So as Kelly mentioned, I'm a recently retired librarian, not a journalist, but I come to you as a reader, and so many of my questions relate to you in that sense. Now you said that your favorite book as a child was My Name is Asher Lev by Chaim Potok, a novel about an Orthodox Jewish child who wants to be an artist. And you also listed Saul Bellow and Philip Roth as having influenced your work. Why do you think these mid-20th century, second generation Jewish American writers spoke to you?
So it's a delight to be here. Thanks, Julie, and thanks, Kelly, and thank you to Spencertown Academy, which is just up the road. It's a real honor to be amongst the local crew. And thank you to everyone who's here tonight on Zoom to be with us. You know, it's funny. It's hard to say what when I read Chaim Potok, I started with The Chosen because it was assigned to me in 8th grade reading class, and I loved it so much. And then I read In the Beginning, which was sort of even more in the weeds of the sort of Hasidim and all of that. And it was a funny thing. I was a Muslim kid in Milwaukee, but somehow I felt like I was reading about people I knew, and I didn't know any of the terminology. It wasn't like I knew Yiddish or that I had any Jewish friends or anything like that. But there was something about the struggling with being in America, but being a part of a different culture, or being part of a different religious culture, because I do think that the religious culture of the United States is fundamentally Christian, and that there was something about being not Christian, and all of that was just very, very familiar to me. And so then I read My Name is Asher Lev, which just was an extraordinary experience. I mean, I was, 13, and I couldn't understand why. My parents wanted me to be a doctor. My mom had trained me to say when I was, 4 or 5 years old, I will be a neurologist when I grow up. When somebody asked me what you want to do, I didn't even know what a neurologist was, but that's what I was trained to repeat it. So I did. But, you know, I was still supposed to become a doctor as far as I knew. I didn't, you know, I had a high school teacher when I was 15 who kind of changed my life and made me want to become something else. But at 13, I still thought I was going to be a doctor. But I'm reading this book about this Jewish kid, this kid born into a Hasidic family who has this amazing gift for drawing and wants to be an artist and is destined, is called to art. And I thought I was reading about myself. It was so weird. It was such a weird feeling. Like I would look up from the book and I was like, I don't know how to draw. Why do I think this is me? But I was so transported. Then, you know, years later, Chaim Potok came out with a sequel to that, The Gift of Asherlev, I think it was called, you know, where Asherlev is now moved to the south of France. And I don't know, it wasn't as good.
I like it when authors plan on sequels or series. That's what I sign up for. I don't like it when they decide, you know, we need 5 more Dune novels. No, thank you.
Right.
You know.
Right.
So, have you watched Shtisel?
I haven't. No, I haven't seen it. I mean, I've heard of it, of course. But I haven't seen it.
Right, because it's another, you know, instance in where, you know, was out a Hasidic family in Israel. That became a worldwide phenomenon when it hit Netflix. And they went back, you know, 7 years later.
Right.
Yeah, we did another season. So as a librarian, I know that there is such a thing as Amish romance. So nothing surprises me anymore. Now, in one instance, you described yourself as Proust meets Jerry Springer. But the one that's
the aspiration. It was an aspirational self.
Oh, okay. Goal.
If only I could.
It's actually a pretty interesting guy, but this is the one I like better. I'm the guy who writes about money and love and faith and greed, which I think is.
And exactly, I usually say murder as well with that. So there's a lot of death in my work. I mean, because death is an important part of, you know, being alive.
But money, love, faith, and greed is so American. I really feel, you know, that is a great one. So you have degrees in theater and film directing. How did money and the world of finance become of interest to you? My dad,
he forced me to, well, he made a deal with me when I was in my early 20s. He said, if you read the Wall Street Journal every day, I'll pay your rent. So he and my mom knew that if they could get me reading about something, I would get, that was the kind of pattern that if I started reading about something, I would get interested in it. And I have this weird autodidact thing where I just get obsessed with something and then that becomes my reality for a period of time. And so for a bunch of years, finance was, I was just obsessive about learning about finance. You know, and I still think a lot about it. I still think a lot about monetary policy and things like that. So
yeah,
that's what happened.
That helps.
Yeah.
But and you also I wrote down a lot of quotes. You said, I'm a tragedian because my parents' native sense of what was true about life was pitched in a minor mode. And yet there is a lot of humor in your books. And as you know, as is easily apparent from talking to you for 5 minutes, you're a very funny guy. So how does that work? Money, greed, also happiness, I mean, and comedy and laughs.
Antonio Gramsci, the great Italian Marxist philosopher, has a wonderful quote, I think, that sort of sums it up. Pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. That's it in a nutshell.
There's other people watching, otherwise I would be writing this down, but it's all being recorded so I can go back to it. Now,
I mean, I think both points of view are true about human life. You know, all of the fully fleshed out narrative modes are essentially responses to the question of the meaning of life, whether it's romance or comedy or tragedy. Each is a fully articulated response, emotional response to, why am I here? I'm here for joy. I'm here for knowledge. I'm here for love. All of those forms. And so I think that, the one that's more native to my own sensibility, I think at a core level, is tragedy. I think that at the New York State author thing, Joe Donahue asked me a question about this, and I said I was a tragedian, and the audience laughed. I was like, oh my God. And it's unusual, I suppose, to call yourself a tragedian in this culture. It's not unusual in other cultures. I mean, the French culture, the great form is tragedy. But I think, it's a little more unusual here. We don't think about death so much. We like to think that we're probably going to live forever in some ways, at least from the point of view of what the story is that we are telling ourselves as a people. It's an optimistic story. So in a weird way, I'm kind of counter against the grain in that respect. But, Mike Nichols once said, the hero of a story is the character with the most jokes. And he's right. I mean, he, of course, was a great comedian, but he's right. The audience attaches to the character who gives them the most pleasure. And so, if you're going to write dramas, you're going to write plays, you're going to write TV or whatever, you better know how to tell some jokes, because otherwise, the audience is not going to be getting enough pleasure to have a hero.
That's a great answer. So let me just ask one thing. This month, you succeeded Colson Whitehead as the New York State writer, which I'm very happy that we have a state writer. Yay. And you'll be the state writer for
mandated by the legislation. I mean, the University of Albany has to select a state author because it's legislated. And so, which is, I guess we're the only state that's got that. I just learned that, which is, I think, pretty cool.
I did not know that.
We're the only state where it's mandated by the state houses.
So besides having to consent to interviews with retired librarians, what does the New York State writer do? Are you on hand in case of literary disasters, emergencies? What's the job?
We're going to find out. I think as far as I know, the clearest thing that I have to do is I have to select the next state author with a group of people. So at some point in the next 2 years, but I'm sure there'll be opportunities to meet people. I think libraries are going to be an important part of whatever is the trajectory of events that they'll have me involved with. And I'm looking forward to that. I mean, it was a total surprise. I didn't even know, I know Colson in it, but I wasn't aware that he was doing this. And anyway, just I'm honored. I'm very honored. So.
Well, that's wonderful. Libraries, you say? I know a guy. We'll talk later.
Good.
Now, since you're the New York State writer, are you still going to root for the Packers? It's. Well,
what's funny? In a book about contested belonging, about not being entirely clear what your place is, because that's what Homeland Elegies is. So much of it is about the question of belonging. My partner, Annika, said to me, isn't it funny that, because on the same day I found out that I was New York State author, I also found out that the book won the Wisconsin Literary Award for 2021. So that was in the same day. And it was, in a book, she said, isn't it funny in a book where this narrator is so worried about his belonging, where does he belong? And the two places that could claim you both, are saying, this is home for you. We want you, which is really lovely. And because so much of the book takes place in Wisconsin. I live in New York, but so much of this book takes place in Wisconsin, where I grew up.
Well, we got you first, but the other problem is New York doesn't really have any football teams, does it? Oh, Buffalo, I forgot about them. Okay.
Oh no, we've got the Jets, we've got the Giants. Yeah. Okay.
Oh, are they teams? Moving on. Sorry, Pats fan. So last year you were reading your third biography of Augustus. How many more have you read since then?
I haven't read any more since then, but I have been reading. I read a biography of Julius Caesar recently, and then I read a couple of books on the Roman Republic, and I have been reading Livy recently. So I'm still in the Roman, and been reading Machiavelli on Livy, and I'm in the Roman thing because I feel like the parallels of where we are politically. It's been very helpful. It's been very helpful to to observe the crumbling of the republic and the rising of a different order. And there's so many ways of thinking about what's happening today that are informed by Roman history. I don't want to overemphasize the parallels, but it's been very, very helpful to see the grand historic sweep of some of those events and how they track with what we've been through.
You also talked about how we feel like we're living in Pottersville. Are we still living in Pottersville?
Seems like it. Rents are going up. Housing prices are going up.
I want to live in Bedford Falls.
There's more money on the sidelines than there's ever been. That money is looking for a rate of return. That money's never coming back into the system except as mortgages. So there's going to be a fundamental support for increased, I was thinking 3 years ago, I remember telling somebody that I thought housing prices were headed north and they were never going to come back because the underlying systemic pressures, and I'm not talking about demand, I'm not talking about generational transfer of wealth, I'm talking simply about the fact that big money needs a return and it doesn't want to come back into the system. And eventually mortgage bonds tend to be the sort of state of the art return after US treasuries. So until that changes, I don't know. I do think we're in Pottersville. I think it's only going to get worse.
When you talk about
pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will.
Let me try and brighten this up a little bit. Let's see. After you received a degree in theater, you went on to study filmmaking and spent many hours watching movies. But you watched movies and watched TV when you were growing up. I just wanted to check on that. And who are your favorite filmmakers?
Oh, wow. That's a great question. I don't think I've ever been asked that question. I think, I fell in love with the golden age of Hollywood, the late 30s and 40s, early 40s. I fell in love with Katharine Hepburn. I did a whole Katharine Hepburn thing. I was, I don't remember, it was 2 weeks. Every day I was watching multiple movies about Katharine Hepburn. I just had fallen in love. I think she still lived in Kips Bay at the time. So I dreamed of somehow getting over to Kips Bay and introducing myself. It never happened, but whatever. It's neither here nor there. So many wonderful filmmakers from that era, Howard Hawks and William Wyler and Billy Wilder. And then sort of later in that trajectory, I spent 3.5 months watching 5 to 6 movies a day. I worked through about 400 films just to kind of get a sense of what, as I said to you earlier before the call, I get obsessive about things. I'm an autodidact. I get interested in something and that's it. It's all I'm doing for a period of time. So this was in my early 20s, I did this. And I gave myself an education. I started with the silent era, then into the 30s and the birth of the talkies, then the 30s and the 40s. And then the Italian neorealists in the 60s, the French New Wave. I watched probably 80% of Bergman's movies. Bergman was a big influence on my vision of things at the time. And then the American independence, the great generation, Coppola, Scorsese, De Palma. So yeah, there's so many great filmmakers. I wouldn't even know where to start. Goodfellas is probably my favorite movie.
Interesting. That is, wow.
I think it's a movie people will continue to watch 100 years from now. I think it gives you a sense of texture and vitality of what it is like to be alive at that time. And I think there's a magic to it. There's really a magic to that movie that I kind of try to replicate in everything I write. That feeling, there's a feeling there that I'm after. So.
Well, there's a certain intensity, and certainly we can't say that Homeland Elegies is not intense. And one thing I was thinking about was in your first novel, I know that, like you say, I'm also tend to be an obsessive, so I read your first novel as well. And in describing that, you said you wanted the book to have the feeling of a continuous flow that a good movie has.
Yeah.
Done. And with the latest novel, you said, this to me feels like more like a literary attempt at reality serial television where the narrator is staging his own self in the way that dramatic self-staging has become the dominant mode of discourse, which I think is amazing. You know, it skips around in time, but it doesn't feel disjointed in any sense. And because of the way it's written, you know, in the first person, talking to the reader, there's no, you know, I always felt that somebody was telling me a story.
Yeah, right.
So again, successful.
Thank you. Yeah, no, that was by design. You know, it was something that happened spontaneously at first, and then I recognized it was happening. And then, you know, people ask me, did you intend to use yourself, use your name? Is it real? Is it not real? You know, when I was writing it, at first, I didn't know exactly what I was writing. I knew it was my voice that was speaking, but I was already deforming by the second page. I'd already changed things that were based in reality, but I changed them. And then I kept doing that, but it kept being my voice. And so it kept feeling like I'm speaking, but I'm just making stuff up because that's the stuff that's easier and is more interesting to me than the stuff that actually happened. And so I just kept doing it. I kept my name out of it. And then at a certain point, some characters started saying my name. So I left that in, and then I read it, and then I would cut it out, and I put it back in. And I think there's 3 instances of my name in the book. And the last name, my parents have the same last name, but their first names are changed. But anyway, yeah, so it was just a kind of an organic thing. And I knew what I was doing. I would say about a quarter of the way through, I really understood what was happening and then I wrote the rest of the book. But, you know, for the first quarter, I was kind of I was in the dark.
Wow. Now, you've talked about your writing process in some of the interviews that I've watched. And I mean, it's fascinating to me that you're a quarter of the way into the book and then like you're feeling it. But how different is that? I mean, you've been such a successful playwright and such a successful fiction writer. I love the story about how you get a chair for each character in your play,
Yeah.
and then you sit in that chair to, you know, voice that character.
Yeah.
Junk had a lot of characters.
Yeah, it did. And when I was at Yaddo when I wrote the first draft of Junk in a tiny room, and there were 7 chairs for the 7 major characters in the room. There was no place to sit. I was always sitting at the computer, or I would get up and move to different chairs. And it's interesting. It's a weird thing that works for me, where I can spatialize the sort of data, if you will, of a particular character. And if I sit there versus somewhere else, I will have different ideas. I don't know how to explain it exactly. I mean, I'm sure there is some sort of an explanation for it, but
no, it's kind of like in Homeland Elegies, where the main character talks about putting the pencil on his finger, and he can remember the dream when he repositions himself in that posture that he had the dream in.
Well, and there is some, you know, I think there is a mysterious dimension to all of this, which, you know, is probably beyond the purview of this call, but I do think emotional meaning is often spatial, that there's something spatial, it's held spatially, and that there's something about the way that we experience ourselves in space that can be replicated or triggered. We can trigger memories that way, or emotions. So I don't know, there's something there with the chair but yeah, I tend to do that. But that's very different than writing a novel for whatever reason. I haven't done that with novels.
And when you've talked about putting plays on, I mean, you work with the cast, you work with the director, the play happens every night. It's recreated every night. And writing prose is, you know, you're a guy in a room.
I often say the thing I love about writing fiction is I get to do it by myself, but that's also what I hate about it. And then I say what I love about writing plays is that I get to do it with other people, and that's what I hate about that. So it's like moving back and forth from being with folks and then feeling the need for solitude, and then getting sick and tired of myself and going back. You know, and it works for me. I'm fortunate to have those two things that I can do. They both come very naturally to me. And I love both of them very much.
Hey, and it's working, so hey.
So far.
Optimism, optimism.
Optimism of the will.
Optimism of the will. Now, something that you said when you were talking about your books on your to be read pile last year, or books that you were reading, when you talked about Uncanny Valley by Anna Wiener.
Yeah.
There's something that you said about that that is stuck in my head. At the end of the book is an articulation that sums up not only the dilemmas of our age, but of storytelling as a means of making sense of these momentous times. She admits to looking for stories where she should have been seeing a system. So I've been walking around for weeks in all kinds of places and situations saying, but what is the system behind this story? What stories can I tell about this system?
Yeah, brilliant, really brilliant. Yeah, you know, I think that one of the dilemmas that we have with regards to trying to make sense of the kind of changes that are on, that, you know, we're entering an era of automation in which the capacity of data processing, computer processors, pattern recognition, all of that stuff is happening with such enormous force every successive millisecond. Not even, I mean, it's happening so ubiquitously and ceaselessly, this kind of ability for the digital matrix of decision-making to deliver goods and produce goods and return on capital and, you know, basically the functioning of the society. And we live in an era of almost complete digital surveillance in which all of our words and behaviors and choices and responses are being translated into information, which is being parsed for patterns constantly. And you know, the world that is arising because of this is not a personal world. And we have a tendency as a species to want a single point of view whose moral dilemmas somehow stand in for something larger. And we tend to see history that way. We see history as the result of individuals who've made choices in history that then change the course of history, when in fact, more often than not, people are doing things and then there's counter reactions and then there's a reaction to that reaction and a reaction to that reaction to that reaction. And in fact, it's a system. It's a sociological system that is molting or shifting or changing because of larger pressures. And sometimes those pressures are emblemized by an individual struggle and sometimes they're not. I think in this particular moment that we're living in, the individual struggle is very difficult to see what's happening from the point of view of the individual. And so how, as a storyteller, to tell a story of a system, that's the challenge. To me, that's the challenge of the moment. And Homeland Elegies is an attempt to respond to that, in which there is a system of incentives, which are both financial, but spiritual, if you will, the desire to belong or the desire to succeed or the desire, and all of those human things are sort of played out across multiple characters in very different settings. And the picture that you start to get, not of any one person, but of the society that's created by all of these various points of view, begins to give you, in complexity theory, they call it emergence. When you have diverse elements, you know, I don't mean diverse as in multiracial, I mean just diverse as in very different kinds of things gathered together, self-adapting. What happens at a certain point is you get a phenomena that could not have been predicted by any of those individual things. And that third thing that comes into being is called emergence. And so emergence is really what I'm talking about, that the effects of our lives and the systems that are in place today are creating emergent effects that we can't predict, and the individual story doesn't help us understand. It's what Anna Wiener beautifully articulates in Uncanny Valley. She's a writer who ends up in Silicon Valley, and she's interviewing these people, trying to figure out what's behind their success, what makes them tick. Well, there is no secret. It's the system. The system's incentives are creating certain kind of people. Those people there's no personal story that would explain why they are succeeding the way that they are. The system tells you why that's happening. Anyway, that's a very long answer, but to a very good question.
It was a great answer. You've given me so much to think about, and added to my to be read pile, which is fine. It's just fine. Now, another thing that I wanted to just ask about, in your novels, there's numerous examples of women who play a role in your becoming a writer. Fatima, the mother in Homeland Elegies, is a big reader. She reads Marcus Aurelius and gives the death of Ivan Illich. There's, I don't know if the high school teacher at age 15 is a woman.
Yeah, she was a woman, yeah.
And then the college professor who in the book is named Mary Maroney, wonderful character, fabulous character. And then my favorite, Aunt Asma, who says, a day spent reading is not a great day, but a life spent reading is a wonderful life.
Yeah.
Put it on my grave. I love it.
Women have been the great teachers in my life. And I think that I've been fortunate to be, to have had those brilliant women who've opened the spirit for me. I mean, they've really operated as a great rabbi or a great priest in your life, or a great pastor, somebody who really helps you see the bigger picture. And I've been fortunate to have a half dozen women in my life over the course of my life, almost all women. There have been a couple of men, but almost all women who have really been the central guiding, shaping forces for my intellectual and emotional journey. So it's a recurring character, and I'm sure it'll probably continue to recur. It's just what I see when I see the picture in my mind of the pedagogue. When I see the picture of the one who knows, who is sharing their knowledge or has access to a process by which knowledge discloses itself, that person invariably presents as a woman in my mind. It's just what happens in my imagination. It would feel odd to me for that to be a man. I don't know why.
And I also read, when you were a child going back home to Pakistan, you would sit with the aunts and listen to their stories.
Yeah. Well, their stories were so much better than the men's. It was just so much better.
The men are just watching sports, and then the women.
Well, not in Pakistan, but yes.
Oh no.
They just talking about politics and money and stuff, and like that's boring when you're a kid. The stories that the women are telling were so much more interesting and so much more human. And so, they had the real intelligence of life, as opposed to, I think I was probably also too young to recognize the posturing going on between my aunts. I was so enamored with the content, and all I saw was posturing with the men.
So let's see, we have a couple questions in the Q&A, but I also realized that we had talked about you reading, and we just started talking and having a conversation.
Yeah. Do you want me to read? You want to answer questions? What do you want to do?
Well, let me look at the questions. We have a couple questions. Let's answer a couple questions, and then maybe you read. Because I love to hear you read.
Great.
Do you visualize an impact you hope your work might have on our American culture? Something you'd like to influence for the better?
No, I don't. I thank you though for the question. I'm touched by it. I have only one goal when I write. It's the same goal every time I write, is to absorb the reader in a higher deeper state of being. That there is some process of immersion in a narrative flow that, if done right, can elevate you to a different order of being. You are seeing connections, feeling things, connected to something in yourself, connected to a seeing. And that's the state that I aspire to live in. And art is at its best, I think, the best conveyor I've found for that. And I am always seeking that. I'm always attempting to find a way to unity with the reader in that state of absorption. And sometimes that state of absorption comes through sympathy with the character, sometimes fear about what a character is going to go through. Sometimes it comes through making an unexpected connection. Sometimes it's seduction. Sometimes it's the beauty of language. Sometimes it's the surprise of an event on stage. All of those things are the tools by which that absorption can be conjured. And I'm always in the process of trying to be mindful in myself when that absorption seems to be happening for me in the work. That's all I care about. I don't care about anything else.
Wow. I think that's a wonderful lead into you reading.
So the beginning of the book, Homeland Elegies, is a chapter called Overture to America. So this is just the beginning. No context needed. I had a professor in college, Mary Maroney, who taught Melville and Emerson, and who the once famous Norman O. Brown, her mentor, called the finest mind of her generation, a diminutive, cherubic woman in her early 30s with a resemblance to a Raphaelesque Puto, which was not incidental. Her parents had immigrated from Urbino, a scholar of staggering erudition who quoted as easily from the Eddas and Hannah Arendt as she did from Moby Dick, a lesbian, which I only mention because she did often, a lecturer whose turns of phrase were sharp as a German paring knife, could score the brain's gray matter and carve out new grooves along which old thoughts would reroute, as on that February morning 2 weeks after Bill Clinton's first inauguration, when, during a class on life under early American capitalism, Mary, clearly interrupted by her own tantalizing thought, looked up from the floor at which she usually gazed as she spoke, her left hand characteristically buried in the pocket of the loose-fitting slacks that were her mainstay, looked up and remarked almost offhandedly that America had begun as a colony and that a colony it remained. That is, a place still defined by its plunder, where enrichment was paramount and civil order always an afterthought. The fatherland, in whose name and for whose benefit the predation continued, was no longer a physical fatherland, but a spiritual one, the American self, long trained to worship its desires, however discreet, however banal, rather than to question them, as the classical tradition taught. Ever tumescent American self-regard was the pillaging patria, she said, and the marauding years of the Reagan regime had only expressed this enduring reality of American life with greater clarity and transparency than ever before. Mary had gotten into some trouble the previous semester for similarly bracing remarks about American hegemony in the wake of Desert Storm. A student in the ROTC program taking her class complained to the administration that she was speaking out against the troops. He started a petition and set up a table in the student union. The brouhaha led to an editorial in the campus paper and threats of a protest that never actually materialized. Mary wasn't cowed. This was, after all, the early 90s, and the consequences of astringent ideological fire and brimstone, or sexual abuse of power while you're at it, were hardly what they are today. If anyone had a problem with what she said that afternoon, I didn't hear about it. The truth is, I doubt many of us even understood what she was getting at. I certainly didn't. Worship of desire, tumescent self-regard, a colony for pillage. In her words was the power of a great negation, a corrective to a tradition of endless American self-congratulation. It was new to me. I was accustomed to the God-blessed light of the world exceptionalism that informed every hour I'd spent in history class. I'd come of age in the era of the hilltop city, gleaming for all to see. Such were the glorified tropes I learned at school, which I saw not as tropes, but as truth. I saw an American benevolence in Uncle Sam's knowing glare at the post office, heard an American abundance in the canned laugh tracks on the sitcoms I watched every night with my mother, felt an American security and strength as I pedaled my 10-speed Schwinn past split-level and 2-story homes in the middle-class subdivision where I grew up. Of course, my father was a great fan of America back then. To him, there was no greater place in the world, nowhere you could do more, have more, be more. He couldn't get enough of it. Camping in the Tetons, driving through Death Valley, riding to the top of the arch in St. Louis before hopping a riverboat down to Louisiana to fish for bass in the bayou. He loved visiting the historic sites. We had framed our photos of trips to Monticello and Saratoga and to the house on Beale Street in Brookline where the Kennedy brothers were born. I recall a Saturday afternoon in Philadelphia when I was 8 and father scolding me for whining through a crowded tour of rooms somehow connected to the Constitution. When it was over, we took a cab to the famous steps at the museum. He raced me to the top, letting me win in homage to Rocky Balboa. Love for America and a firm belief in its supremacy, moral and otherwise, was creed in our home, one my mother knew not to challenge, even if she didn't quite share it. My mother never found in the various bounties of her new country anything like sufficient compensation for the loss of what she'd left behind. I don't think mother ever felt at home here. She thought Americans materialistic and couldn't understand what was so holy about the orgy of acquisition they called Christmas. She was put off that everyone always asked where she was from and never seemed bothered that they had no idea what she was talking about when she told them. Americans were ignorant to her, not only of geography, but history too. And most troubling to her was what she thought connected to this disregard of important things, namely the American denial of aging and death. This last irritation would yield a malevolent concretion over the years, a terror-inducing bête noire that saw her to her grave, the thought that growing old here would mean her eventual sequestering and expiration in a home that was nothing like one. My mother's views, however rarely voiced, should have prepared me to understand Mary's dyspeptic take on this country, but they didn't. Not even my Islam prepared me to see what Mary saw, not even after 9/11. I remember a letter from Mary in the months following that terrifying day in September that changed Muslim lives in America forever, a 10-page missive in which she encouraged me to take heart, to learn what I could from the trouble ahead, confiding that her struggles as a gay woman in this country, the sense of siege, the unceasing assaults on her quest for wholeness, the roughness of her route to autonomy and authenticity, that all these had been but fires beneath her crucible, provoking creative rage, tempering sentimentality, releasing her from hope in ideology. Use the difficulty, make it your own, was her admonition. Difficulty had been the flintstone against which her powers of analysis were sharpened, the how and why of what she saw, but which I still wouldn't see truly with my own eyes for 15 years to come. No, I wouldn't see what Mary saw until I'd been witness to the untimely decline of a generation of colleagues exhausted by the demands of jobs that never paid them enough, drowning in debt to care for children riddled with disorders that couldn't be cured, and the cousins and the best friend from high school who ended up in shelters or on the street, tossed out of houses they could no longer afford, or until the near dozen suicides and overdoses of 40-something childhood classmates in a mere space of 3 years, and the friends and family medicated for despair, anxiety, lack of affect, insomnia, sexual dysfunction, and the premature cancers brought on by the chemical shortcuts for everything from the food moving through our irritable bowels to the lotions applied to our sun-poisoned skins. I wouldn't see it until our private lives had consumed the public space, then been codified, foreclosed, and put up for auction, until the devices that enslave our minds had filled us with the toxic flotsam of a culture no longer worthy of the name, until the bright pliancy of human sentience, attention itself, had become the world's most prized commodity. The very movements of our minds transformed into streams of unceasing revenue for someone, somewhere. I wouldn't see it clearly until the American self had fully mastered the plunder, idealized and legislated the splitting of the spoils, and brought to near completion the wholesale pillage, not only of the so-called colony, how provincial a locution that seems now, but of the very world itself. In short, I wouldn't see what she saw back then until I'd failed at trying to see it otherwise, until I'd ceased believing in the lie of my own redemption, until the suffering of others aroused in me a starker, clearer cry than any anthem to my longing. I read Whitman first with Mary. I adored him. The green leaves and dry leaves, the spears of summer grass, the side-curved head, ever avid for what came next. My tongue, too, is homegrown, every atom of this blood formed of this soil, this air. But these multitudes will not be my own, and these will be no songs of celebration. That's the opening of the book. And goes from there.
So I would just like to say that this puts to rest the question that so many people ask me, which is listening to an audiobook the same as reading a book? Now you read the book for the audiobook, so obviously maybe better.
I've generally felt with the two novels that I've written that the book wasn't finished until I read the audiobook. That's what I kind of I've told both engineers, that somehow the process of being able to read the book to the reader is actually the final stage, because I'm a dramatist. And so there's something about what you can activate in language and cadence, in delivery, that you just cannot do on the page, no matter how hard you try. You just can't do it. You couldn't put diacritical marks. You couldn't, italicize all over the place. You just can't convey the meaning. There's something about storytelling which is fundamentally something to be heard. And I think that, my dramatist technique, or the DNA of myself as a dramatist goes back to that, if that makes sense.
It makes total sense. It makes total sense. So we do have a couple of questions coming in on the chat.
Sure.
And the Q&A. So let me how do you begin your day of work? Do you have a daily goal?
Yeah, I tend to, if I'm writing actively. It's funny. There's so much stuff that comes with I'm sure it's like that for any business. When you have a little bit of success, there's so much stuff that you have to do around the work that's not the work itself. And so, I try to spend as much time when I'm actively writing. It's 9:30 to 1:30, 2 o'clock every day. That's my, I try to not have any meetings, not any calls, nothing like that, to leave that time open. But it's been a while. It really was not, it had been a while before Homeland Elegies, and then it has been a while since Homeland Elegies that I've had kind of open, uninterrupted space to really write. I'm longing for that, and hopefully I'll be able to create it. But I'm writing for TV now, so it's like there's a lot of moving parts and lots of folks involved and a lot of communication, and it's one of those periods where I'm writing with other people that I'm enjoying, but I'll get sick of it soon. So.
You're writing with two women right?
I'm writing with Andrew Morantz at the New Yorker, and Cecilia Kang and Shira Frankel at the New York Times. I'm drawing on a lot of the reporting that they've done over the past few years. We haven't been writing together actively yet, but that may be in the offing. We'll see.
So here's a question from the chat. From David Whitford. I wonder why you left Rochester for Brown. If Rochester was where Mary was, that must have been a difficult parting.
Mary wanted me to leave, actually. She thought that it was time for me to go and go somewhere else, go somewhere where I was going to be able to pursue what it was that she thought. She was encouraging me to sort of pursue my work in the theater and my passion for the theater. There wasn't really much going on at Rochester in that regard. So, but it was incredible. I spent so much time with her, as I did with my high school teacher in high school, who changed my life. I spent as many as every semester I had Mary, either for a class or an independent study, sometimes both. So I learned a lot from her, but she was the one who encouraged me to go.
So she recognized, she recognized how talented you are. And so is she not the same teacher who suggested sending your short story to the New Yorker?
No, that was not the same person. That was a creative writing teacher named Tom Gavin at Rochester. It's amazing. Years later, I'm still in touch with Mary, obviously, but she invited me to a conference of writers conference that she throws, every year. And I was supposed to give some sort of a class, but then, in her opening speech, the first night she gets up and gives this lecture, and she has a visual presentation, and on the screen behind her is this Yeats poem in my handwriting that has all the scansion, like all the trochees and all those sort of accents and the sort of like rigor with which I had analyzed the prosodic analysis of this poem by Yeats. It was an assignment that I had created for myself in her independent study, that I was doing prosodic analysis of Middle Yeats poems, and just to sort of get a sense of how he was using rhythm. And she saved these homeworks that I had created all of these years later, and she put them up on the thing. And I just started bawling. I mean, I just started crying. I was like, I mean, she back then thought that what I was doing was worthy enough to keep a folder of it. I mean, that's unbelievable. That's crazy. I mean, she's my biggest fan. She's also, a great interlocutor. She's brilliant. Her name is Mary Cappello. Her real name is Mary Cappello, and she's a brilliant writer in her own right. So.
Oh, that's a beautiful story. So let's see. Getting pieces of paper. Who is your favorite poet?
Well, that's too easy. That's not, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to diminish the question, but it's just Shakespeare. I mean, it's Stephen Booth. I think, we were talking before this event about the Stephen Booth edition of the sonnets, which is one of the great masterworks in literary criticism probably ever. Stephen Booth describes Shakespeare. He says that trying to compare Shakespeare to other poets is like comparing King Kong to other monkeys. It sounds so far-fetched, but it's so true. It's like he's an alien or something. It just he's not even in the same zone of aliveness and depth and diversity of experience and the totality of the human consciousness, every feeling state, every possible thought, it's all there. The natural world. It's not, I think it was somebody who once said that if the world could speak, if the trees and stones could speak, they would be speaking Tolstoy. It's what creates the trees and stones is what Shakespeare is. There is some unification to the creative expression as it's happening. He is the articulation in language of that movement from nothing into something.
You make me feel like I've been wasting time just reading the plays.
But the plays are great too. I mean, the plays are great poetry as well. I mean, everything that is in the sonnets is in the plays. The sonnets are just like a very, very compressed. The plays are like cocktails. The sonnets are like shots, Plays have got a lot of stuff in them, and sometimes they're great, and there's some areas they're just perfect, but the sonnets are like these shots of pure poetic consciousness. Helen Vendler, the great Helen Vendler, has she has a lifelong obsession with Shakespeare sonnets and wrote a book about it. You couldn't write enough about Shakespeare, as much as people have already written about him.
Another one for my to be read pile. Okay, so here's another question. Do you think that the TV show The Chair was influenced by the character of Mary?
I guess I wonder which professor, because the Sandra Oh character doesn't really teach in the show. So there's no there are no ideas that she offers, and no, the only teacher who actually says anything is the fellow who gets, punished for pretending whatever his. So no, I mean, I think probably I would hope, I mean, I don't think so. I don't think that anybody involved with the chair read Homeland Elegies, or maybe they did, I don't know, but I don't think there's any attempt at a reference, or I don't believe so.
And then there was one last question, which is, what are you writing for TV?
I'm writing the adaptation of Homeland Elegies for FX. And I am also in the process, early stages of writing a show about Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg, and Facebook, and some of the crises that they've been through over the past half decade. And Claire Foy is going to be playing Sheryl Sandberg. So
Fabulous.
yeah.
Do you have input on who gets to play the part and who plays the part?
I mean, it's a collective decision between a group of, I have a great group of collaborators, producing collaborators. They're just amazing. And, every week we come to decisions together, but mother is, necessity is the mother of invention. So you don't always have your, with Claire, we got lucky because I wrote it with Claire in mind, and Claire is perfect. And, but going forward, you just don't know who's available when they're available. You can't, you've got to, it's a process, landing on the right person. With Claire, it was kind of divine timing. So
That's amazing. I've never heard an author say that except once before, that they got the person they wrote it in mind
with
for.
Claire, I wrote it with Claire in mind, and we were able to get it to her somehow. So.
And I also think that the fellow from The Big Sick who's tapped for Homeland Elegies, love him.
He's great. Yeah.
Great.
He brings bring out some much needed levity in the book, especially for TV,
Oh yeah. Yeah. Love The Big Sick. So that's exciting. Has the pandemic proved to be, any diversion or detriment, or gotten in your way?
It forced me to make a choice about where I wanted to live. And so we're in Kinderhook, and I couldn't be happier. So I think
Do you
life.
have a library card to the Kinderhook Library?
I don't, but I did give them all my books. So.
Happy face. It's a wonderful library.
I also donated all my books to the Chatham Library. So.
Must have been after I left.
Probably.
Sadly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wonderful. Well, we love having you here. And I see now that we've run out of time.
Time flies.
Hello, Kelly.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you so much, Ayad. Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you, Julie.
Pleasure.
And thank you, everyone, for being here with us this evening. If you need more information, please go to spencertownacademy.org. I know you know that because you got here tonight, right? So thank you, everyone. Have a good evening. Thank you again. Thank you, and good night.